Good morning. My name is Tushti, and this is my husband, Surendra, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. You know, when I was a little girl, we played a game called telephone. And there would be a row of children, and the first one would think of something to say, and then they would turn and whisper that to the child next to them. And that child, in turn, would whisper what they had heard to the one next to them, and then so on down the line. And finally, the very last child would stand up and say what they had heard. And be assured it was never what it started out to be. And in the teachings this morning, Jesus was speaking to the fact that the Pharisees had moved too far away from the heart of the teachings. And you can see how that can happen when we employ the mind, because the mind is a limited resource. We factor in the multitudes of filters that it's all the information is going through, our emotions, our desires, our egos. Well, that'll tangle things up right there. And then throw in a little past or present karma, and look what you've got. We are not our minds. We are not our bodies, for that matter, and even though we become very attached to them. We were born of divine consciousness. We are in this world, but not of it. And all we have, and all we'll ever have, is that consciousness. You know, once when Swami was speaking of the mind, he said the intellect wants to make spirituality complex. And I think, again, it's because the ego entangles it. We had an interesting experience last October. We served as the bookstore for a conference titled Science and Non-Duality. Well, the presenters, it was a whole array. There was a tribal African shaman presenting, all the way to quantum physicists. And each one used their own vocabulary to describe or define or how to prove the presence of the divine. The shaman, he was just this beautiful being. He was a well-educated man, and he was adorned in vibrant tribal colors, and he even had the disc in his lip, and he had painted bone in his ear. And he related to man's innate and intimate relationship with nature, with the land and the animals, and trusting that spirit would provide whatever was needed. And then there were those who had had personal experiences, and their lives had crashed. They had just lost everything. Their jobs, their relationships, their finances, their health, maybe all at the same time. It was just smack. It was all gone. There was no place to go. There was no one to turn to. When all was lost, they turned to God, and He answered them. And then we move on down the line, and there's the scientist's approach. And there was this one book. It was as big as an encyclopedia. And it was all equations, one page after another, after another. And I was sort of thumbing through it, and finally I just flipped it to the end. And it seemed to just add up to zero. Master defined divinity as the Christ. The Christ consciousness is the unmoving stillness at the heart of every spinning atom. Just think of that for a moment. The unmoving stillness at the heart of every spinning atom. Each and every one of us have the potential to experience that divinity. When Master came to America in the 1920s, he taught people how to sit and how to meditate. He taught them to turn their gaze within. And we have those same tools of meditation, energization exercises, kriya, raja, and we can find our own way into that inner sanctuary. Jesus said, "Be still and know that I am God." Last month, we taught the Meditation 1 class, and it was a new year, and so we asked the students how many might have learned to meditate a New Year's resolution, and almost all of them kind of raised their hands. And we said, well, what are you looking for? Well, they were longing for inner peace, ways to handle the stress in their lives, and how to quiet their minds. One of the things we teach them are the super conscious living exercises. Now, these are purposeful and they're playful. It moves positive energy all the way through their body, and you know them. I am awake and ready. I am awake and ready. I am positive. energetic, enthusiastic. Well, some of our more serious students, they were doing their awake and ready, but the expression on their face was, "Get me out of here." But you know, they all lightened up. I could say melted down, but I'll say lightened up. They, you know, after 4 weeks, they all changed. I think their hearts were more open, and now they had tools that would help them. Because even a little practice of this inward religion will free us from dire fear and colossal suffering. And suffering is the harvest of the mind, whereas joy is the bounty of the heart. You know, there's a very sweet story about St. Joseph of Cupertino, and he lived during the 17th century, and he was also known as the flying saint. And he had a rather difficult and challenging childhood because he was very simple-minded, and people often took advantage of him. But he was lighthearted, and he loved God. And when he was 17, he wanted to become a friar, but he was actually turned down because they didn't think he was capable of learning the scriptures, not intelligent enough. Well, as grace would have it, when he was in his 20s, he was admitted to the Franciscan order. And they did give him just the menial tasks. He cleaned the stables and he tended the animals, or perhaps he worked in the kitchen. But no matter what was asked of him, he was joyful, and it was as if God was right by his side. And as it happened, to everyone's surprise, he passed his exams. And as it were, God's grace, the examiner asked him the one text, to recite the one text that he actually knew. And so time passed, and he was giving Mass. And he was kneeling before the altar and gazing up at a picture of Mother Mary. And he went into ecstasy, and he just floated up off the ground. Well, everyone was quite surprised. And the thing is, it began to happen more and more frequently, even though his superiors told him to stop. He couldn't control it. And at one point, I mean, the people were so drawn to him because his devotion was almost tangible. And it continued. And at one point, he was called before the Inquisition. And they questioned him and questioned him. And they could find no wrongdoing. So they released him. But it was decided to take him out of the public eye. And so he was sent away. And then later, one of the story was that he was actually sent into exile and was locked in the basement of the basilica in Assisi. And he had a small cell. And on his altar, he had a little doll. And this doll, to him, represented the Mother Mary. And he tended to it lovingly every day, and he would weep with joy. His heart was so full. Well, Saint Joseph passed blissfully at the age of 60. And 100 years after his passing, he was canonized. He was recognized as a saint. And his lightheartedness, his devotion to God, and his love was just inspirational. It still is to this day to all of us. Sometimes we can take our lives much too seriously. No, I'm too busy, I have too many responsibilities, there's not enough time. And the list goes on, right? But that is all Maya. Maya is that veil of delusion that separates us from God and is very seductive, as we know. But it can also cast a shadow over our hearts. We are children of God, and that thought is so comforting when we hang on to it. And we need to hang on to it. We need to tend to our relationship with the divine in even the smallest ways. Every week when we read the Festival of Light, we hold the candle and we gaze at this uplifted candle, and it's a symbol of God's love. And we pray with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my soul, and with all my strength, I choose thy love. I choose only thee. It's up to us to initiate the conversation. And when we do, our hearts open. Our purpose in this life is to find God. to commune with God, even if he does not reply. As a beautiful chant says, we keep calling him. It says in the Bible to dwell in the house of the Lord. And the house is our hearts. And that's where joy abounds. Especially when we can surrender into that infinity that abides within our hearts. And then we have that great gift to share.
I too would like to talk this morning about devotion. It's a slightly unusual topic for me. As the affirmation said, devotion belongs to the heart. And I've always been a little bit more of a mental case myself. And so maybe, hopefully, these next few minutes will be good for both of us. Swami Kriyananda has given us the affirmation this morning to use as a focal point during this week. It's intended to show us the value of leading with devotion in everything that we do. The question is, are we going to take that to heart and put it to work, or leave it up here until it disappears into a forest of other thoughts and obligations? It's funny, isn't it, how easily we can forget what we most need to remember. I think of devotion as a kind of language. It's a language that is not so often spoken these days. We speak more a language of our own secular Western culture. But it's a language that, like others, can become second nature to us. When we grow up with a language, it does become second nature. And without thinking about it, we find that the words we need to express what's on our mind are flowing to us as we need them. And hopefully that will continue for the rest of my talk as well. But as I said, devotion is not a language that is so common today. Far more common is the language of materiality. And we use that language, don't we, almost exclusively for getting ahead, for getting what we want, and perhaps even for trying to get around the idea that devotion is something that we need for our greater happiness and well-being. It's easy to sort of get sucked into society's concept rather than that much, much deeper devotion. As I said, devotion is a language that is not exactly one that I'm yet completely fluent in. That's something that I'm working on throughout most of my life before coming to Ananda. A devotional person to me was someone who lived in a very different world than mine. He or she was okay by me, but just not as cool or successful as I wanted to be. I was more devoted, if you will, to the trappings of outer appearances and winning the approval of others. And that particular mindset dies rather slowly, especially when there's still an irksome part of you, the ego, that would like to have it both ways. So how does someone like me transition from here to here? Well, the trouble is, of course, that devotion is not what this guy wants to practice. And he is not going to retire readily or easily to some distant background in your mind. What he says is, come on, man, let's go out and have some fun. Devotion is for people with limited interests. Get with the program. You've got 5 good senses. Let's go out and show them a good time. Well, thankfully for us, God is not some mere mean-spirited being up there that is going to make us pay dearly for every sensory pleasure that we may indulge. But the question does become, to what extent, how often, and at what cost to our inner life do we allow those sensory pursuits to define us? At Ananda, we strive to practice the principles of simplicity and moderation. And there are very good reasons for this. And one of those reasons is that when you have less to get in your way, that less becomes more. It becomes more creativity, more gratitude, more forgiveness, compassion, peace of mind, and ultimately a life more infused with joy. Now, you know as well as I do that the impulses and desires that invade our minds can drive us to distraction and maybe sometimes even drive us nuts. But here is a tremendously encouraging fact. We can change. Our ability to change is perhaps the most important asset in our little bag of tricks, because unlike any other creature, we are not bound by our conditioning, no matter how deeply it may be imprinted. We can change. It's just wonderful to even think of it that way. No matter the negativity that you may have endured in your life, whether it's a dysfunctional family, certainly sessions of lousy breaks and bad luck, unforgiven mistakes, all of that is just waiting for us to cut it loose and be done with it. We can change. We can even develop devotion to God where it may not have been particularly strong before. As Meister Eckhart has said, the seed of God is in us. We don't need a full moon or the right alignment of stars to plant that seed in fertile soil. It was planted the day we were born. We just need to do some serious weeding so that that seed can grow. Weed out the fears. Weed out the anger, the old grudges and griefs, the disappointments. And when you do, you discover a freedom that no material advantage can match. There's another reason to nourish that seed, and it has to do with what happens if you don't. The universe, you see, has a rather perverse sense of humor. And to the extent that you resist making positive changes in your life, it will hammer you, I guarantee you, with setbacks until those changes are made. But we can change. Devotion is a feeling, but in part it is also a skill. And skills are acquired through practice. If you're stuck in your head, practice chanting, practice japa, repeat the name of God or a sacred mantra in your mind until your brain, exasperated, just shuts itself off. Practice simplicity, moderate your desires. Practice serving where service is needed with no ulterior motive or personal agenda. And when you do, you will discover just a wonderful freedom that, as I said, no material advantage can possibly match. There's a sad but humorous story about the great comedian W.C. Fields shortly before he died. If you've seen any of his films, you know that Fields' on-screen persona was that of a rather misanthropic and self-inflated fellow who was always looking for some angle to win his way. And that persona was, of course, largely played for laughs, but Fields himself in real life was a firmly avowed atheist and not given to considering the alternative. In the months before he died, knowing that his days were numbered, Fields was confined to a hospital room where friends would come to visit him. And on one occasion, when a friend entered, Fields was reading the Bible. In shock, the friend said, "Bill, what are you doing?" And Fields turned to him slowly and answered in his very famous manner of speech, "I'm looking for loopholes." Well, looking for cracks in God's design is not where we want to be as death draws near or at any time whatsoever. And there's no better insurance against that potential than working on growing the devotion that you already have, no matter at what stage of growth it may be. With devotion to God and in doing unto others from that same loving perspective, you've got the keys to the kingdom right in your hand, or should I say, right in your heart. There's no mystery here. Devotion will take you home. Don't say you'll just think about it. Give it legs. It makes no difference where you are on the road to freedom of God, with God. As Sri Yukteswar said, the lives of men are dark with many shames, but we can turn that story upside down because we can change. We can.